1976's Burnt Offerings is a bit of a strange film that ultimately doesn't understand what its source material is trying to say on a fundamental level. But still, there is something about its over-the-top melodrama and the bizarre tensions between Oliver Reed and Karen Black that I find it fascinating as a work of art, even if it doesn't fully work as a cohesive product. It is based on the excellent novel of the same name from 3 years earlier in 1973, that came in that initial rush of really excellent horror titles that started the horror publishing boom, like The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby, The Other, Hell House, The Stepford Wives, and The Sentinel, among others. It is one of the best few-year periods in horror publishing history, and what happened here can be very much still felt today, as we've covered before. The novel tells the story of the Rolfe family, a mother, father, son, and elderly aunt to the father, who lives with them in their small apartment in New York. The sounds of the city keep them up at night. Ben is having a near-nervous breakdown from the high demands of his job, and the day-to-day reality of living in that environment is draining Marianne of her happiness, so she advocates that they leave for a while, rent a summer cottage just to get away from the problems of the city. And they find instead a mansion out in the middle of nowhere that they can have for the entire summer on just 2 conditions. One, that they look after the place, and tend to its gardens, and perform the regular maintenance required for an estate like this. And 2, that they look after the 85-year-old woman who lives on the top floor by herself. Ben feels as if this is too good to be true, and soon discovers that he is correct in that assumption, as he begins to notice his family change around him, that even he too is changing, that when one of them suffers a mild injury, soon after the plants in the gardens will look more healthy, and that the wallpaper in the house will seem to be more fresh, and he begins to fear that he has brought his family into a giant Venus flytrap that is slowly digesting them from within and driving them mad. Author Robert Marasco was born and lived in New York, and I wish that I knew more about him, because I think his opinions on the city might inform some of what he was trying to say here in this text. I find it strange that he was a high school teacher, then on one of his summer breaks wrote a play that would open on Broadway, that would be nominated for a Tony, then soon after would write Burnt Offerings that was a huge success, and then just sort of seemingly stopped writing except for one additional novel in 1979 that people seemed to kinda hate. And then he just continued to be a high school teacher until he retired, which I find highly strange, and would love to know what was going on there. The film adaptation was directed by Dan Curtis, which really is the linchpin that is needed to understand the creative leaps and choices that the film is making when compared to its source material, as the melodramatic flares that are added here are very much in line with the work that he did on his horror soap opera, Dark Shadows, in the late 1960s. And I do think that some of these changes from the original novel work to give the film a more overly surreal and gothic tone that is especially helped when watching it today by the fact that the house they are filming in is the same one from another surreal horror movie filmed in 1979, Phantasm. But many of the changes alter the story to the point of removing the intended narrative messaging that Marasco had with his novel. Basically, Curtis and team seemingly thought that the novel was a bit boring and wouldn't work as a movie because there's not really any actual scares in it. It is just an overall tone of dread that is sustained over its nearly 300-page length, which is very difficult for a movie unless you're an expert craftsman. The most famous change from the novel is an addition that is made, where Ben is suffering from delusions of seeing a figure that does not actually exist, an evil hearse driver that he believes he saw as a boy, who now haunts him in this house as he's slowly being driven mad by its power. Actor Anthony James is just in a few shots across the entire film, but delivers one of the most unnerving performances in horror history. Everything about this simultaneously does not make any sense within the context of the original novel, but also absolutely works, and was the right call in trying to make the film feel more impactful. Other changes, however, do not work. In this same mindset, the filmmakers add an additional 15 minutes or so to the novel's ending, which was fairly subtle and understated. In the book, Ben dies trying to save his son from drowning in the pool. While in the house, Marion accepts her place as becoming the new Mrs. Allardyce. It is much more mystical feeling and strange, a horrible, bizarre, wrong ending that gives no answers but works in its ambiguity. The movie, however, did not find this to be interesting or exciting enough. Marianne is able to save her son from drowning in the pool, and the family decides to leave, but right at the last minute, she's compelled and called back into the home. And Ben is forced to confront his fears and come face to face with his wife, who has become possessed by the spirit of the old woman. She flings him from the house, killing him in front of their son, who she then brings down a chimney to crush him, so that the grounds can feed on their essence. It is more bombastic, sure, brutal. It is more exciting, but is it more scary? It is not as esoteric and unknowable, and goes for a feeling of shock that is easier to communicate on a visual level, rather than the more complex tone of pure emotional revulsion that the novel goes for. And, it is shocking. The movie literally ends with child death, which even today is still taboo to do. But for me, it does not work on the same wavelength of horror sophistication. The film also cuts the entire first third of the novel out, leaving it to where the first scene of the movie is the family arriving to the country home, meaning that we never get to really see them in New York, and thus the metaphor is more or less lost in the translation process. The book is about how New York is spiritually devouring these people, and that they think that some time away in the country will be all that is needed to fix their problems, but instead find that there is little difference between the city and the countryside, and that what they assumed was a problem with New York was instead a core problem within America that is draining the lifeblood of anyone who tries to just make it by. The family constantly talks about money, and how expensive things around them are, and how beautiful commercial objects are. They are very compelled to desire the very things that pose the most danger to their life and happiness. They thought that a nice middle-class job in the city would fix their problems, but instead it only slowly kills them. And so they move to a house to get away from that world and find that it too will only slowly kill their spirit. And without that contrast of locations, then the film instead turns into just a spooky haunted house story. A vacant retelling of an actually pretty complex novel that I'd love to see get remade more accurately as a film today. The one thing that is almost universal about someone experiencing burnt offerings for the first time, and its madness-inducing house of ghosts that warp the personalities of the loving family into harboring violent thoughts about each other, is that it will inevitably make you see Stephen King's The Shining in 1977 in a worse light. Everything that Burnt Offerings is doing is a prototype laying the ground for what King would do in that novel, where he would utilize the basic frame of the family doing upkeep on an older haunted house for a season, isolated from the world, that preys upon their vices, where he projects his own problems such as alcoholism onto it, making it its own new kind of thing. But still, he probably takes a little too liberally. The house even has plants in the garden that protect it and fight the family when they attempt to leave, which King turns into the shrubbery animals of the Overlook Hotel's maze. And Ben has a little secluded office where he spends his time writing on his typewriter. And King has even talked about his love of burnt offerings publicly in the past, which, is a little brazen if you ask me. Because if your fame was in part built on the back of ripping something off, then I would probably say that you should just avoid mentioning that if you can ever publicly. But he would once say that this novel was near brilliance, a disturbing tale, and one that comes highly recommended, not just to fans of the genre, but to the general reader. I've also felt that Kubrick's added ending to The Shining is probably a subtle nod to Burnt Offerings as well, as both the book and the movie ends with us seeing the photographs of the people that the house has eaten since it was born, ending with a new frame portrait of our protagonists and latest victims. And this is not the only time that King has done this to varying degrees. He's relied on EC Comics multiple times, informing in part his depictions of vampires, as well as most notably his homage to the EC era in the form of Creepshow. His story in 1993, The 10 O'Clock People, is about a man who discovers that all people with political power, from the police to media personalities and even the heads of the government, are actually bat-like creatures that are masquerading in human skins, which is essentially just the exact same concept of They Live that came out in 1988. I love it and I love Pennywise, but that 1986 novel derives heavily from 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street, to a degree that could have probably almost been litigious, and actually was even once sued over something like this, but eventually won the case and was deemed innocent, when a creator involved with the Warren comic title The Rook took action over him with The Dark Tower, citing similarities between the gunslinger Roland Deschain and the protagonist of The Rook, Reston Dane, a time traveler who uses revolvers who dresses like an Old West cowboy despite being from a fantasy universe, who goes on adventures where he fights horror and sci-fi creatures. King even admitted to having read those comics in the late 70s, but was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing because of the main differences that The Dark Tower has from The Rook. And I'm not even trying to say that this is all bad. We take our inspirations from everything around us all the time, especially things that we experienced when we were younger. And King has kind of made a career out of making horror that is kind of about horror history. I'm not trying to fault him, just more so pointing out a pattern within his work of how he develops ideas. The thing that makes the cultural impact is always found within the execution of the core idea. To be culturally remembered, it is not about being first rather than being the best. And unfortunately for Dan Curtis, Stephen King's adaptation of The Shining is operating on just a different realm as far as overall quality is concerned. They aren't even playing the same sport. Not that Burnt Offerings is a bad movie by any stretch of the imagination, but when compared to one of the best horror films of all time, then of course, it's gonna pale. I think that the original novel is much better than what King did in his book, but because of the existence of Kubrick's movie on a cultural level, that is neither here nor there. Which leaves us to where Burnt Offerings is today, a weird little movie and a great book that have both been more or less memory hold. They were very important in their time, and have impacted the horror landscape massively, but do not get the credit for the initial concept today that they probably deserve.